drink coffee before this. That took 1 minute off my time. Thank you, Ernie, for the introduction. You said that I was born in Hood River, Oregon. That tells you I was a native-born American citizen. And being native Oregonian, I have webs on my feet and oil on my feathers, so I seldom use an umbrella. And there are only 6 years of my life I did not live in Oregon. 3 by choice and 3 not by choice. And you can guess which is which. And if you do the math, that makes me 86 years old. My father came to the United States in 1904. He was lucky, got right under the wire of 1907, they referred to him. He was 23 years old, born in 1880. He would be 138 years old if he were living. He came because he was born into a family of girls, and there were only 2 boys, and he was not the oldest, which was bad news, because he wanted to be a farmer. He grew up on a rice paddy, of course, but he wanted to be a farmer and had no hope of ever owning land to become a farmer. So there were 3 choices for him. One, which is a common thing and still is somewhat in Japan, that you could marry into a family of all girls and marry the oldest daughter, and then you became a son-in-law of sorts, but you didn't have much authority, because the wife would wear the pants in the family because that's where the money is. My dad didn't want to do that. So I said, well, I'll join the army. Well, he was rejected because he was too short. He was about 5 feet my height, 5'1" or so, all his life. The third choice was to go to the golden land of opportunity. Guess where that was? California. So he asked his mother, who was the head of the household, to give him enough money for one-way passage on a boat to the golden land of opportunity. And that would have been something under $100, I would guess about $50, which must have been a struggle for her to make the decision to let him do that. So he came on a boat to San Francisco, intending pretty much to stay in the United States. He worked on the railroad in California, and he came to Oregon and they began to build the railroad from Portland east. So he was laying rails from Portland east, and he saw the Columbia River Valley, the mid-Columbia Valley, along the Columbia River, with snow-covered Mount Adams across the river in Washington, and Mount Hood to the south. So I grew up in a house where I could look out the kitchen window at Mount Hood and out the living room window and look at Mount Adams. And my father said, this is the place. So from 1904 to 1911, he saved his money. First, they were like indentured servants because they had to pay the entrepreneur guy who found them the job to lay the rail, and they had to pay for the room and board first. So it took him a few months or years, I suppose, to pay that off. And then he began to save his money so that he could buy some property to start an orchard. He found a place to buy in Hood River, way up in the hills of the boondocks, where only a fool or a Japanese person would try to farm. The first thing he had to do was build a road up this hill to his property. And with a horse and a pick and shovel, he built a road. The property was on a huge hill where he raised asparagus eventually, and the top of the hill was flat, where he was going to start his orchard. He had to cut down the trees, sell off the lumber, it wasn't lumber, it was just trees, dynamite the stumps, and plant fruit trees, apple trees mostly. And in those days they didn't have dwarf and semi-dwarf trees, so it took 7 years for the trees to mature to bear fruit. Well, he was a rice paddy guy. He didn't know anything about fruit orcharding. So first thing he did was to write to his mother and say, I'm ready to get married now. I have a home place, and men didn't want, when he worked for the good pastors, Mr. Goodpasture said, "Oh, will you marry an American woman or a Japanese woman now that you're going to live in America?" My father said, "No, no, I'll not marry an American woman, only Japanese woman." And he said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I noticed you get up first in the morning, and you start the breakfast and make the coffee, and then when your wife gets up, you have to tighten her corset strings." He said, "None of that for me." So he wrote to his mother and said, "I'm ready to get married." So, as very typical of not only this country, but European countries too, you sent for a wife back home. So my grandmother, who probably was involved in that original kind of marriage where the man went into, because she definitely wore the pants in the family. And I never heard the details, my father never told me, but he said my mother was a very strong woman, and my father was a quiet, meek sort of guy, and then became an alcoholic. And he said, and I couldn't understand why. So from that I have to conclude that that marriage was that one of those. So she picked out 4 or 5 women she thought would be perfect wives for my father, and sent their pictures. I never asked my father, never knew how many he got. But I'm supposing he got like 4 pictures and selected which one he wanted to marry. So it was a picture marriage, like you referred to. My mother was 18 or 19 years old, and my father was by this time 30 because he worked to save that money. And my mother came to Seattle on a ship with 40 picture brides. Wow. And that wasn't the only ship. There were several like that who brought these. She came because women and children could come, even after the 1907 Exclusion Act, or Gentleman's Agreement. So she came, and she said for 2 years she never went anywhere. She was at that farm that my father started, and the only Japanese people she ever saw, any person she saw, were friends of my father. And she said she nearly died of loneliness, and when she finally was able to go out and go into American Caucasian homes, the smell of butter and cheese she were overcome by the smell of it. And after that, I heard that, I thought, I wonder when people come into her house, they think it smells like soy sauce. They had 8 children, and my oldest sister was only 2 or 3 years old when my parents made their first trip to Japan after they married. And she was a little girl, 2 or 3, and the babe in arms was my oldest brother. And my son found a certificate saying my mother entered the country through Seattle in 1916. And something's wrong about that certificate. I have always said my mother came in 1911, and I still believe she did, because when you figure out how old my sister and my brother were, it doesn't figure, it doesn't work out. So I'm still saying my mother came in 1911, because she couldn't have 11 children, or 8 children in the period of time from 1916. It doesn't make. Well, we didn't have birth certificates because my father delivered 6 of the 8 children at home himself. And if you add that all together, and I knew we were at least 2 or 3 years apart, it just doesn't compute. Well, so they worked for other people to learn how to have an apple orchard, and then eventually they could stay at the original homestead, you might call it. And later he bought the orchard where I was born, which is 5 miles to town, which about, or the other place was 9 or 10 miles. So you couldn't go to get a doctor anyway. What's going to happen? Your wife is in labor. My father actually delivered a couple babies of 2 other families because they didn't have the courage to do it. They come and say, Mr. Asai, come,
Yeah.
my wife's going to have a baby. And so he delivered a couple of them, but he said after a while he thought about the responsibility and the liability, because he said, my wife was strong and healthy, but what do I know about his wife? So he quit delivering other people's babies after that. When I was born, I was a very difficult birth, and my father said the first children my mother bore, she never made a sound. She grabbed those iron bedstead, and her arms would turn white, and there'd be perspiration pouring down her face, and she would not let out a peep. But when I was going to be born, she said, kill the baby or do something. And he didn't know what to do because there was a problem, and so he hitched up the horse and went into town 5 miles, not knowing whether my mother and or I would be alive when he got back.
What was the
We
problem,
both
Mom?
survived.
What was the problem?
I got my arm with 2 legs caught.
One arm, one leg.
One leg out, one leg in. So when the doctor came, my mother said it was the most painful thing she ever experienced. He pushed me all the way, he put his arm and pushed me all the way back in and out.
Rotated.
Rotated. My brother, one of my brothers was a breech baby with his butt out first, I think, and my mother survived that one without further help. So that's the background of how we ended up in Wood River, and I'll tell a little bit more about the properties.
A little closer. Closer.
Okay. On December 7th, when Pearl Harbor's attacked, I was 9 years old, and I remember it very distinctly. I already had 2 brothers in the Army, one who had volunteered in June, and one who was drafted in December before, so the first week of December before Pearl Harbor. And nobody can convince me when they say it was a surprise attack. There was going to be a surprise attack, they just didn't know where. Because my brother, who had volunteered, back in those days, basic training was like three months or something. And so he was due for a furlough before going overseas. And in September, he wrote and said, my furlough has been delayed for some reason. They didn't tell me why. And then in October, he wrote and he said, my furlough has been deferred again with no reason given. And in October, he wrote and said, my furlough has been canceled. I'm being sent to Santa Barbara, California to help guard the coast. What was that about? So he never had a furlough until we went to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, and he got his furlough to go across, to go to the Asian Theater. Both of my 2 brothers went overseas, went to the Asian Theater, Far East, and to fight against the Japanese.
Wow.
And that makes sense because my oldest brother was in military intelligence. And they came to the camps and tried to recruit Japanese American soldiers because they thought, with the language. But my brother had to go to language school to learn how to read and write Japanese because he didn't know how. We just knew how to talk with our parents somewhat in low-level, uneducated speech. So he went to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, that you remember, and Camp Savage in Minnesota before he was sent overseas. My other brother, who was a feisty guy, the one who volunteered when he was able to volunteer, he said the recruiters came to his camps over and over trying to talk him into going to military intelligence when he said, get the hell out of here and don't come back. So they didn't. And he ended up in the Pacific Theater, but not as a military intelligence person. Well, anyway, Sunday, December 7th, we heard the reports on the radio of the attack. And we thought, or I was too young to think, but my adult siblings thought, what's going to happen? I went to school on Monday, and I was spit upon and called a Jap by kids I'd known, you know, all that fall that we were in the 1st through 4th grades. And I was very perplexed. And we were then given the notice that we were going to be evacuated. Let's talk about those euphemisms. We were going to be evacuated, and we were relocated, and we were sent to assembly centers, which I call hurry up and lock them up camps, and relocation centers, we were relocated from the assembly center to the relocation center, and later they said, you will be detained. And I said, for how long? And they said, for the duration. So you're being detained and you don't know for how long? And you're going to be there for how long? For the duration? How long is that? We didn't know at all. So we had to report. There was on all the town telephone poles, there was a notice saying, be prepared. We were lucky enough, we didn't have just 1 day or 1 week. We had like 2 or 3 weeks notice. And we're told, you can only take what you can carry. There's a book called Only What You Could Carry. And it was edited by Lawson Inada, who's the name you may recognize as a retired professor from Southern Oregon University, and he gives talks all over. Since we could take only what we could carry, I, as a 4th grade child, also had to carry the heaviest 2 bags I can remember, and we had to decide what we were going to take. Well, I thought, we're going to go on a train. I was so excited, my first train ride. And I thought, I wonder if my classmates will come to say goodbye. And nobody showed up, of course, because they didn't know I was leaving. And I thought to myself, well, they can't come. It's a school day. But later I found out they didn't know I was going to be leaving, or that our whole family was going to be gone, and every Japanese family in Hood River was going to be gone. And it wasn't until last year or 2 years ago I thought, how did we get to the train station? Because we couldn't drive there. We had to leave our cars behind. And so most of the people didn't know we were going to be evacuated, but there had to be a neighbor or a friend who knew, because they had to take us. I mean, how could 2 bags each and people, we couldn't walk 5 miles to the train station. But I didn't think about that at that time. We were sent to Pinedale, as he said, near Fresno, California, out away from the city, and I went back to try to see the place. It's totally disappeared. It's part of the city of Pinedale now, Fresno now, it's residential section. We were there for several months, and although I was young and I felt I didn't have psychological damage from the experience, to this day, I can tell you that we left Hood River on May 13th, 1942. And I can tell you we came back home to Hood River in April 20th, 1945. I also knew that on the label that I had to hang on me, all of us, and our baggage was 16339. I'm from family number 16339.
Question.
Mitzi?
Oh.
Over here. I was curious what happened to the family assets, the land, property, the car, the house.
Okay. We had at least 2 families who were very close, friendly to us. One was a neighbor, Carl and Hazel Smith. They took care of our Chrysler. And another couple, the Wallaces, took our piano and our carpet, which was luxury item, a nice carpet, and they kept those. The rest of our things, we had a stone house next to our house where it was like our refrigerator. We didn't have a refrigerator. We kept fruit and vegetables in this cool stone house. So we stuffed a lot of stuff in there. And then the kind kind of stuff you don't want to get wet or whatever, we put in an upstairs bedroom and put a has-been lock on that. Well, of course, you just unscrewed the hasp, and when we got home, everything was strewn everywhere. And yes.
But why didn't we lose our farm like most people?
Yes, I'll say that. And when we came home, my mother cried, and she said, went up there and she said they stole our American flag. And they torn the photograph albums and strewed the pages all over that room. So hasp and lock was worth nothing. My father, we accused him of being Scotch, not Japanese. Because he was like this. But after all, he fed 7 children, and by the time Pearl Harbor came, he owned 3 orchards, he had no mortgages, and he had money in the bank. I don't know of any other family that I've heard anything like that. So that's the kind of dad I had. I mean, how many people can do that?
So what happened to other people?
So other people, like in California, many of them, most of them were truck gardeners, raised vegetables. You can make back then, you could make a living on 20 to 30 acres for a fruit orchard. But to raise vegetables and earn a family, support a family, you have to have at least 100 acres. And of course, the Japanese could not afford to buy 100 acres. So they had to lease land from Caucasian folks. And so most of those people didn't own property. And when they wanted to come home after the war, nobody would lease to them. And Hood River people didn't want us to come home either. So they mounted a terrible discrimination program, which I'll talk about a little later. So the laws in California were always the worst. When they passed the Alien Land Law in 1927, did you say? My father, oh no, it was only about 1913, because my father bought the property in 1911, and he always had a great sense of what would happen in relation to something of the present. And he was sure that Oregon was going to pass an alien land law. So in order to avoid that situation, when he bought that piece of land, he put it in the names of my 2 oldest brothers. So our orchards were always called the Asai Brothers Farm. My 2 brothers were preschool age.
So why was it that your parents, who had lived 30 years in America, were not citizens?
Well, he mentioned that.
No, he did not.
My parents were aliens, of course, because they were Japanese, and Asian people were excluded from the naturalization process. So of course they were aliens when the war came. Although my father had lived in this country for 30 years, and my mother for like 26 or whatever years, they were both aliens. Yes.
So you registered your older brothers.
My father
at
did.
birth, so they were recognized as citizens.
Yes, all of us were born in the United States. The situation doesn't come up until somebody wants to, somebody can do a bad thing, but if nobody reports you, you might get away with it. So whatever that was, I don't know. But my brothers' names were on that property, and when they became 21, the official papers were drawn up that they would be the adult owners of that property. So that wasn't the only first thing my father did that was smart that nobody else thought about. So after that, I think when we acquired the next 2 properties, I don't know what happened with that alien land law, whether it no longer was in effect or whatever. I think they were always called Asai Brothers Orchards, so apparently they were still kept in my brother's names. So officially my father didn't own any properties, but he had no mortgages and money in the bank. So we're glad he was Scotch.
We should talk about the executive order.
Yes. Executive Order number 9066, another number that is indelible in my brain, was signed by FDR. But FDR didn't want to have to deal with the details of it, so he just turned it over to the U.S. Army. And you know how well the U.S. Army does things. So General DeWitt was in charge of the Western Defense Command, of those districts that he referred to as Section 1 and Section 2. And he was not an open kind of person. And he was my brother's commanding officer, so to speak, up there, from the general down to the private that my brother was. The one who didn't get his furloughs, and he was sent to Santa Barbara. Officially, he was under General DeWitt's command. Well, among the Japanese American community, General DeWitt is a swear word. Well, and he had absolute no experience even as an officer, as I'm told. So he didn't deal with the situation too well. The big controversy of whether they were going to be sent from our homes or not, they had a governor's conference. And all the governors said, we don't want them, we don't want them, we don't want them. And in spite of the fact what you told about Topaz and Utah, the governor of Utah was the only one who said, we will let them be in our state. But the other people overruled what the governor said. When we went to the Assembly Center, there were 7 of us. You want me to tell? Oh yes, any or all persons may be excluded. Do you see any word in there that says Japanese, Japanese Americans, Issei, Nisei? That could be you next time. So if you're Swedish and we go to war with Sweden, you can by that, you could be sent off. So the Japanese American community were very, very cognizant of that. They worked and lobbied for a long time to have this executive order rescinded. And it took 30 years or 40, I can't remember under which president. I think it was under President Johnson. This executive order was rescinded. So you're safe. You're Swedish. Hopefully.
Yeah.
But not exactly. Not necessarily. Yes. Can I go on now?
Yes, please.
I kind of lost my place. What was I talking about?
The order, the executive order.
Okay, all right. He pointed out where we were sent. We went to Pinedale. Oh, that's right. In Pinedale, there were 7 of us, and we got 1 room. And it was 120 degrees in the shade. And living in Oregon, can you imagine what it was like? I forgot to tell you, when I got on the train, I was so excited, and they said, pull down the blinds and don't look out the windows. And we didn't know where we were going, how long it would take. And can you imagine that from Hood River, Oregon to Fresno, California, how long that was, and how hard it was for our parents to keep us kids from trying to peek out the window. And we didn't know until we got there where we were going or where we were. So in Pinedale, there were, as he described, 6 barracks on each side with a mess hall in the middle, exactly as in Topaz. And the fences around the camp were very close, like from here to there. So no matter where you were in the camp, you had to see it. And it was about 8 or 10 feet high, fine mesh wire, and 3 rows of barbed wire electric, like a cow fence has. And we us kids would play, and there were at the corners of the camp, as in Topaz, there were these tall watchtowers with a soldier with a gun up there guarding us in the camp. They weren't as happy up there, just as unhappy as we were in the camp, having to do this duty. So sometimes we play ball and the ball would go over the fence. And there was a little road outside the fence and fig trees. The first time I'd ever seen fig trees and figs that were ripe hanging there. And we were so curious about that. One of the sentries came down when we threw the ball went over the fence, and he picked the fig and poked it through the fence so we could see it and feel it and eat it. That was my first fig. I think subconsciously, as I look back, I'm thinking, I don't think that soldier's gonna shoot us. And when they'd come down and retrieve our ball and throw it over the fence, they would sometimes smile. And we thought that was our assurance that he wasn't there to shoot us. So if the soldier was pretty good looking, we somehow lost the ball over the fence. It was so hot there, and we had concrete floors, sort of like this, and each family could get a block of ice, which we'd sit in the middle of the floor, and we'd sit around it like you sit around a pot, like a fire to keep warm. It was just the opposite, trying to keep. My oldest brother, who was with us, 7 of us, was deferred, because if you had already had 2 sons in the Army, then it was hardship for the families, supposedly, so government. You were classified 4C, I believe it was. And that was my brother's classification. That's why he was with us. He worked in the camp bake shop in that 120 degrees in the shade location. And he was glad to have something to do, but when they said, if your fancy had security and Utah needed sugar beet farm work, you could leave the camp. So he says, yay. And he left. So he did not experience the relocation center, only the assembly center. He left and went to Utah. And while he was there, he had had 2 years of college at Linfield College, and gone there on a chemistry scholarship. And he thought, well, if I go to Chicago and get a job, maybe I could go to night school at the University of Chicago and maybe get my degree. So he after he worked in Utah, he went to Chicago, which is where he was when we were finally released from camp in 1945. Oh yes, that showed my brother Min in that last picture. The one on the left is Min, who was in the bakery shop and went off to Chicago. My brother Gene was later drafted from the camp. So he went into the Army quite late, probably 1944. This is Hart Mountain. We need to talk about Tule Lake first. From Assembly Center, we were sent to Tule Lake. And some of those folks who were in the Santa Anita Racetrack Assembly Center, Californians, mostly city folks, and people from San Francisco ended up in Tule Lake with us. And the people who were in the Santa Anita Racetrack were given 1 or 2 horse stall rooms. And although they covered the dirt with boards, the smell of manure and things would come up, especially in the heat. And some of the Japanese people said, if you don't laugh at your situation, you have to cry. So we decided we have to laugh. And they had a sign contest. And they put up Manure Mansion, Dung Palace. So you have to laugh, right? And we had this conversation with city folks and the country folks. And we had some Hawaiians who were visiting their friends in California and at the time, and they were evacuated, and they were madder than hell. Because Japanese Hawaiians are quite different in personality to Japanese Americans on the continent. The Japanese Americans on the continent have taken on that Japanese influence of the Issei, the immigrant parents, that no matter what happens to you, You live in the present. You don't dwell on the bad stuff or the good stuff of the past. You dwell on what you're doing here in the present. You've got enough to do here so that you can make your future beautiful. So people on the continent took that on. We are referred to as the quiet American. We were so quiet, these stories we're telling now did not come out till 1970, late or early 80s, because the third generation insisted on bringing it out. They suddenly, by accident, said, "Grandma and Grandpa, Mom and Dad, you were locked up for 3 years?" And there was no answer. For a long time, they didn't get any answers because we were the quiet Americans. So now, since then, books and books, talks and talks happen. Okay. We were, at the time, those two questions that Ernie talked about, my father was 69 years old, and he answered yes to both of those questions. He had the same sense that he had earlier when I was telling you, he put the property in my brother's names. We were, because we said yes, yes, we didn't have to stay in Tule Lake. Today, if you've ever heard the name Tule Lake or anything about it, you think about the negative things that happened there after we left Tule Lake. Because all the people who answered no, no in all 10 camps were clumped together in Tule Lake. It became a segregation center. So it was a terrible place to be. I want to tell you a very touching story. In my 5th grade class, there was one Caucasian boy, and it wasn't Ernie. His name was Donald Harkness, and I went to a Tule Lake reunion, kind of, for the first time in 2006. They'd been having them quite a bit, but I didn't go till I was in 2006. And I thought to myself, as I was driving to Klamath Falls, I wonder what happened to Donald Harkness, and why was he there with me in the 5th grade? And when I got to the reunion, there was a blackboard that said, if you lived in Tule Lake and are willing to have an interview, sign here. And it said, Donald Harkness, MD, and another Harkness, MD. I never knew about this other Harkness. And I thought, oh my God, they're here. And so I went into the dining hall, had about 350 people, and they all had black hair except a few that didn't. So I went up and looked at each one and thought, could this be Donald Harkness? They didn't look like Donald Harkness, I would imagine. So I gave up. The next morning breakfast, I did the same thing. I still didn't see anybody. I thought, they came and they've left already. So we went outside to get on the tour buses, and the guy who was going to be the whatever for that bus had a board. And I said, oh, you have the names of the people on this bus? He said, yes. And I said, do you have a Harkness name on there? Oh, yeah, I've got 2 of them already on the bus. Oh, I jumped on the bus. This is 63 years later. And I said, I'm looking for Donald Harkness. And this gray-haired, very good-looking gentleman goes, so I went and sat next to me, we talked, and I was so excited about the whole experience, I forgot to get his address or his email address or anything. And 3 or 4 years later, I wanted to communicate with him because I wrote a second book and I knew I had his name in there. I wanted to send him one. So I was so frustrated, but I knew he had been the department chair of medical department at the University of Wisconsin. So I wrote a letter in care of the medical department of the University of Minnesota. Please forward in big letters, and I did hear back. So I did contact with him. Well, from Tule Lake, then I went to Heart Mountain, and this is a photo of Heart Mountain. Maybe the 2 of you can split it up. This is the typical view of a relocation center, and Heart Mountain and Tule Lake were 2 of the larger ones. And so You can see the barracks, and I know that I lived in the barrack right over here. And at that time, my brother Min was gone, and then my brother Gene graduated from high school and left to work. And so there were just my brother in high school and me and my mother and father left in Hartmount. There I am with my mother, my brother Gene, and my brother Dick. And Gene then left the camp before we were, allowed to go home. And then there was my mother, my father, my brother, and me. My brother Min, who had gone to Chicago, was not yet in the army at this point. And he said to my father, if you're going to go home with Dick and Mitzi, you better do it pretty soon, because the American Legion in Hood River is wanting to get rid of us, so they changed my classification to 1A to try to draft us out of here. And there were 3 of them, and they decided they'd better go home and check it out, because my brother said it might be dangerous, because they were having full-page ads in the Hood River newspaper, weekly newspaper, with something like, we the undersigned tell you Japs not to come home. If you come home, we'll make life miserable for you, and be columns and columns of names of people that we'd known all our lives would sign this petition. It was very discouraging. My mother was reading those ads, and she was scared to death. And my dad says, well, he says we better go home in a hurry because of the situation. So who all wants to go home? He votes, my brother votes, and I vote, and my mother votes no. She's so frightened. And my dad said, well, you're outvoted, so we're going home. If you can come with us if you want. So of course we went home, and what we faced in Hood River was the worst time in my life. I was 13 years old, and I had to walk 1.25 miles to school every day and 1.25 miles home. Nobody would play with me at recess. Nobody would walk with me. Nobody would talk to me except the teacher. And I was 13. You can imagine what it's like to be a 13-year-old. And these were kids I had grown up with and went to the 1st to the 4th grade. Well, I decided when I graduated from the 8th grade there in this elementary school, I was going to get on a bus and go downtown to junior high school. And my given name was Mitsuko, and they called me Mitsuko or Mitsuko in the first place, which I didn't like. And I thought, it's no fun being Japanese. I'm going to be 200% American. I'm going to change my name and register at the junior high school as Mitzi. But I didn't tell anybody. And when my report card came home, my father, who's a very Zen Buddhist, looked at the report card and saw Mitzi, and he smiled. And he looked at me and smiled. He didn't ask me any questions. He never brought up the subject. I've been Mitzi ever since. I named myself in the 9th grade. That's my time.
Don't worry about 10 minutes.
Okay. I went through high school. I had no dates. I couldn't go to the dances. I only went to the football games to sell hot dogs for the money making for groups of organizations I belonged to. By this time, my classmates, my peers were speaking to me, but I didn't have dates. There were 2 Japanese American boys in the high school, and I was expected to date them. And this is not fair to them, but I'm telling you, I thought they were both stupid or not good looking, so why would I want to date them? And if I wanted to go to the dance and went with them, I'd have to dance with him all night because nobody else would dance with me, so I didn't go. At Sadie Hawkins' dance, I thought, here's my chance. And I thought about, a couple of guys I'd really like to go with, but then I got to thinking, if they didn't want to go with me and they said no, I'd feel hurt. And if they wanted to say yes, but they were afraid, they still wouldn't go with me. So I just gave up on that idea. I had my first date as a freshman at the University of Oregon. To tell you the evolution of my family's name from discrimination to acceptance is, we were always known as the Asais. If you talk to any old timers in Hood River, they'll always refer to us as the Asais. And we liked that because that did not indicate maybe that we were Japanese. So we were going to be assimilated, we hoped. But today, with the third, fourth, and fifth generation, they are known as the Asais, which is the correct pronunciation of my family name, Asai. So my great niece is a lawyer in Portland, and I'd never really known her because she was born long after I went off to college and never came back to Hood River. And she had an office in Portland, so I thought, I think I'll go and see what Jessica's office looks like. So I came to this building, and I went in the front door, and there was a receptionist desk, and it was like 2- or 3-story building. And I said, has Jessica Asai arrived yet? And she gave me this stern look and said, you mean Asai? And I said, yeah, that one. All right, this is Max Moore, Mrs. Max Moore and Reverend Sherburne Burgoyne, which were two of probably 10 people on the fingers of my hand I can name to you to this day who stood up and helped us and were not afraid to show their friendship to us. And there was a honor roll on the side of the courthouse with all the Japanese servicemen, all the servicemen from Hood River. And in 1944, there were 16 Japanese American boys' names up there, including my 2 brothers, the first 2 who went in. And the American Legion Post erased those 16 names from the honor roll. And we got national publicity. Little Hood River, Oregon made the New York Times over this. And the American Legion National said, you know, they were embarrassed about it. So they wrote to the Hood River chapter and said, you put those names back on there. And they said, we're not gonna. And the American Legion National said, if you don't put those names back, we're gonna take away your charter. So they said, okay, we'll put the names back, but only because we don't want to lose our charter. So they had scrubbed those names off so successfully, the board was rough, and they couldn't paint the names back. So they had to drive nails or pegs in there and write the names on a piece of board and hang them. So when I came back from camp, the first thing I wanted to do is look at that honor roll, see if my 2 brothers' names were back up there. They sure were, all 16 of them stuck out. So that's the honor roll. That's Hazel and Carl Smith, our good neighbors who took care of our Chrysler and who also housed my brother, the one who came back from Chicago to look the situation over because our house was not vacated yet. So Min lived with them, stayed with them. Hazel's cousin owned the store that was 1 mile from my house that I passed every day to school and to church. And he had a no Jap trade sign on the door of his store. And he was the man who came to our house before we left to go to camp with tears in his eyes and an address book and said, please keep contact, write to us. And when he got home, he had a no Jap trade sign on his door. And I had to pass that every day going to and from school. And he was a cousin to Hazel. And Hazel was in the store one day. Ralph Sharp says, hey, Hazel, I don't like the way you're treating these Japanese, or Japs or whatever. And she said, what do you mean? You think you don't approve of my Min Asai staying in my house? Well, she said, well, I don't care to do any business with you. She walked out and never stepped in her cousin's store after that. So that's the kind of friendship and courage of those 12 people. There were many other people who wanted to be helpful but didn't have the courage. And I'm telling you, as the end of your previous speaker said, What you need to do is straighten up your backbone. Speak up when you need to be, you know something's right, you don't do anything or say anything. It's not the mean, angry, hateful people that hurt us. It was the good people who said nothing and did nothing. And that's the message I bring to young people. When I tell them the story, I go up and say, how would you like it if you were told you could only date 2 boys in your school? And of course they're both stupid or they're both and I do that, and I say, how would you like it if you could date only 2 girls in the school? And I'll tell you what those girls are like. Well, that gets to high school kids. They really get the message. And when they tell me how bad they feel or how sorry they are, I said, don't do that. And I always get to tell them exactly what I just said. When something comes up and you know it's right or wrong, you need to do or say something. Otherwise, things are not going to change, not going to improve. This is my father and mother at their 50th anniversary in the 1960s. Yes.
Is the farm still in the family, the orchards?
It is the farm, not the original farm. It went to seed, as so to speak, because it's so way up in there, nobody would lease it. So you cannot leave a fruit orchard idle for 3 years. It just goes to pot. So he had to sell that off, and there was a reparations bill of, let's see, what property, that kind of a bill that was passed in the 1940s or early 50s. And the Congress appropriated funds to, if you applied and said, I lost so many $1,000s over this, that you could go to courts and get some money. But the story was that if you thought you lost 20,000, you would say, I lost 10,000, and if you're lucky, you got 5,000. That's exactly what happened. So there was some money that was to come for that first orchard, and my brother Min had just married and bought a plot of farm, and my father was going, he said he wanted my father to help him with the mortgage. And he said, Pa, we called him Pa, why don't we apply for loss for that farm? And my dad didn't want to. He just wanted to forget the past and sad things. And Min said, I really want to borrow money for my mortgage. And my dad said, well, okay, if you'll apply for that, do the legwork, I'll give you half, and I'll give half it to Dick, who is working on his PhD at the University of Illinois Champaign. So that's what happened. Got $10,000, gave Min 5 and my brother 5 in college. Well, then he obtained the second property, which is the one where I live, was born. My nephew lives in the house I was born in. And he used to have his own home, but his parents, both his father, which is my oldest brother, the one who was military intelligence, and his wife have both died. So he was going to rent it or sell it, and his daughter, this is 4th generation now, said, Mom and Dad, I want to live where Grandpa and Grandpa lived, which is my brother. So they are now living in the house where I was born and running that orchard, and of course expanded, so they have more acreage than we did have then.
Shall we stop and do questions?
All right, any questions? No questions?
I
Okay.
didn't wait.
You found Donald Harkness. Did you have a chance to visit with him? And
Oh yes, Donald Harkness and I visited all that day. We were on the bus, we'd get on, we'd talk, and then we'd get off, and then we'd get back and talk. So we talked all that day.
so did you find out why he was an Anglo in your camp?
Yes, I said, what were you doing? I know your dad was some kind of administrative official or something. And he said he was the superintendent of schools. And so the 2 sons went to school with us, just as your family did. After it became a segregation center, and there was a lot of rioting, and as you can imagine, these angry folks that had answered no, no, and were given stronger, worse treatment, they had to move out and go to school in Tule Lake High School because it was too dangerous for them to go to school there. So that, and then when he came back to that reunion, he and his brother wanted to see the house where they lived outside the camp. And you can, from the jail that they built at that point, you could look out the barred window and you could see the Harkness's house out there. So they came to see that. And that's standing, but the camp, of course, is all gone. Just like Topaz, you can see the concrete for the lavatory, where the lavatories and so on. The lavatories were no partitions, so you go and sit on the toilet seat with about 8 other people around you. And then there would be a sign in Pinedale where it was 20 degrees so hot, and there's scorpions. And there are huge pictures of male and female scorpion. And they told us, always lift the toilet seat to make sure there isn't a female scorpion. If it's a male one, never mind. There could be a problem. So you're looking at a scorpion on the wall when you're sitting on the toilet. And you're sitting in the mess hall eating, and there's a big sign saying, eat slowly for the sake of your health. Ha! If you ate slowly, you lost all the relishes and stuff that were on the table of the people who sat there before you got there. So that's the mess hall, the way we